Okay, I think we're finally into the mainframe here. Okay, cool. I'm still don't have a producer, so we're kind of figuring this out on the fly. Hello and welcome to Colonial Outcast, the anti-imperialist podcast that will be collaborating on this episode with Mint Press News. This is an important issue that is a hawkish foundation of the U.S. foreign policy in West and Central Asia, Iran. Its nuclear weapons program, also the axis of resistance, a conglomeration of loosely affiliated proxies, though I disagree with that precise term, that challenge U.S. and Israeli policy in the region. And as the drums beat to bomb Iran so that Tehran comes to the negotiating table and withdraws military resources from the axis to the homeland as a fleet of $1 billion B-2 stealth bombers, which can deliver 30,000-pound massive ordnance penetration munitions to underground hard sites, stage out of an airbase in Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. And as the U.S. moves another 2 carrier strike groups to the Persian Gulf, and yeah, it keeps going, as the U.S. stock market absolutely tanks and your grandmother loses her 401k plan, Fox News has a reassuring message for you. It's a moment of zen.
People who are depending, those retirees, all of that, just talking plain speak with them. Look, when this nation used to go to war, people in this country would support the war effort with their materials at home and making things for weaponry and all of that. We got to do 100% buy-in over this bumpy period. Just communicate.
Excellent. Just communicate. So, guys, tighten your belts and do your patriotic duty as oligarchs plunder the government and get stuck into preventable wars. Anyways, tonight we are joined by Dr. Assal Rad, scholar of Middle East history. She works on research and writing related to U.S. foreign policy issues, the Middle East, and contemporary Iran. Her writing can be seen in Newsweek, The National Interest, The Independent, Foreign Policy, and more. She has appeared as a commentator on BBC, CNN, NPR, and she completed a PhD in history from the University of California Irvine in 2018 and is the author of State of Resistance, Politics, Culture, and Identity in Modern Iran. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Yeah. Things are moving quickly, and I only have to subject you guys to just one contextualizing monologue, and then we'll get stuck in. So it's been nearly 6 months since our last episode here on the U.S.-Iran relations, and things have gone pretty much as expected, like the multi-generational U.S. foreign policy dominated by a need to maintain unipolarity and a disdain for regional powers that challenges that has had it out for Iran since the revolution that overthrew the MI6 CIA installed ruler Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi in February of 1979. And since then, there's been a myopic political thrust to overthrow the current government, which is dissonantly at both times supposed to be feeble and on the verge of collapse, and also our greatest adversary, which Harris bizarrely said during her election bid last year, and therefore ripe for regime change operations. Either by popular uprising fomented by information warfare and economic sanctions, or by direct military intervention. And Dick Cheney, our favorite war criminal, was reported by Salon magazine in 2014 to have said in a closed-door meeting with Goldman Sachs bankers that his greatest regret was not invading Iran when they had the chance. I mean, he denied it, but it's widely reported that there was a joke that was popular amongst members of the Bush administration during the run-up to the disastrous invasion of Iraq. A joke intended to signal neoconservatives' ultimate goal to one day topple the government in Iran. Forget Baghdad, went the joke. Real men go to Tehran. So again, U.S. policy is kind of, from my perspective, like a skeleton. It reeks of death, and its structure never really fundamentally changes. Not trying to wax Shakespearean on that point, however, though. But at any rate, I'm hoping to discuss with you, Assal, the nuclear deal, the U.S.-Iranian foreign policy, i.e. the historic nature of their relationships. Obviously, we can't not touch on Palestine, and to get into the internal politics of the Iranian government, if possible. That's never really discussed, especially on similar channels and platforms. But my first question off the bat is, how concerned are you that a military confrontation could ensue from this kind of belligerent posturing that we're seeing right now?
Well, as someone who is of Iranian heritage, who was born and raised in the United States, I've been, pretty much your entire life, if you were born in the 80s or 90s, is you're scared that the US is going to go to war with Iran. Because to your point and sort of what you laid out in that monologue, that has been a goal of neocons in the US for decades, ever since the revolution happened that toppled the monarchy and brought in the Islamic Republic. They have been essentially against the existence of this particular government in this particular state. You could see that in the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, when the U.S. was supporting, although, I mean, the U.S. was publicly supporting Saddam, but then secretly selling arms, that the Iran-Contra affair, to Iran, vis-a-vis Israel, of all states, which tells you something about the sort of political rhetoric that the Islamic Republic utilizes, right? The anti-U.S., anti-Israel rhetoric that they use, but then when they need guns and they need weapons, they'll happily take them in the 1980s vis-a-vis Israel. So that's a little glimpse of the sort of the domestic political situation in Iran as well. The fear is always there because the threat is always there. And what we've seen, I think, in the last decade or so, since, and I'm looking at Trump from maybe less than a decade, around 9 years, when President Trump's first term happens and he withdraws from the nuclear deal and surrounds himself really with Iran hawks, right? The Secretary of State at the time was Mike Pompeo, who is very public about his deep, deep hatred for Iran. And of course, Bolton, who was his national security advisor, who has long, long advocated for going to war with Iran. Where we are now is similarly in this very tense, one miscalculation away from a war, right? It's clear that on the Iranian side, and we can get into many examples of this, it's clear that on the Iranian side, the predominant opinion is avoiding conflict. That's not the entire landscape, right? The political landscape in Iran, similarly to the US, we call them hawks, they call them hardliners, right? So there's the camp that would welcome a war with the United States because it's a minority opinion, but nonetheless, there is that camp exists in Iran as well that doesn't want diplomacy with the U.S. that would be okay and certainly welcome any kind of greater conflict. But the predominant opinion in the country and what you have seen the political establishment actually do is restrain from war over and over again. Now, that is the claim of the Trump administration as well, right? Like on the U.S. side, you're seeing Trump repeatedly say that he prefers not to have a war with Iran, that he prefers diplomacy. But like I said, that's what we talk about, the miscalculation. Wars are by their nature unpredictable. How we get into them sometimes is unpredictable. And so it's very much a question of how we calculate moving forward.
Right. And it basically the messaging we're getting out of the White House especially is very let's just be generous and say frenetic. Trump has a bad habit of communicating foreign policy stances via Truth Social. I again have an account, everybody, so that you don't have to. A couple days ago, he posted the Iran-backed Houthi terrorists have been decimated by the relentless strikes over the past 2 weeks. Not true. Many of their fighters and leaders are no longer with us. We hit them every day and night, harder and harder. Their capabilities that threaten shipping and the region are rapidly being destroyed. Our attacks will continue until they are no longer a threat to freedom of navigation. And of course, the operation's name is Operation Prosperity Guardian. Just keep that in mind. The choice for the Houthis is clear. Stop shooting at U.S. ships and we will stop shooting at you. Otherwise, we have only just begun. The real pain is yet to come for both the Houthis and their sponsors in Iran. And I've been looking at troop breakdowns that's or equipment and material going into the region over the past week. It's only what I can get through open source. But right now we have the ongoing buildup that includes 2 Navy carrier strike groups. 2 Navy aircraft carriers has an air force bigger than every country on the planet except for Russia and China. At least 6 stealth-capable B-2 Spirit bombers, roughly half of the Air Force's fieldable fleet, air defenses of 2 Patriot missile batteries, and 1 National Advanced Surface-to-Air system redeployed from South Korea. Additional squadrons and transport crafts, though the Pentagon remains mum on numbers. At least 140 heavy transport aircraft landed in the Gulf and Jordan last month alone. and this is according to Haaretz, citing open source data. It's a 50% increase from the previous month. Again, what I like to try to do is like not get sensationalist about this kind of stuff. There was a lot of I wouldn't call it like hysteria, but concern over like looking at troop deployments from the U.S. to Syria. But it was just regular rotations. There has been a buildup, but I'd like to remind people that the same thing happened, geostrategically amassing forces like this as a political means of pressure. The last time we did this, had this many Spirit bombers out and this many carrier strike groups out. It was actually staged out of Australia, and it had to do with the Strait of Taiwan. This is something that happens, but the language is kind of, I don't know. It kind of makes me nervous, and especially like when we have hawks like Tom Cotton basically pushing this narrative with the incoming Joint Chief of Staff. This was from yesterday.
President asks for military options to support what he has said publicly, that if Iran is not willing to make a deal, that there will be bombing. Do you commit to provide him the best and candid advice you can about viable military options and the likely consequences of each?
Senator, I think that's what the job of the Joint Staff is to do, is to provide a range of options for the president to consider and then allow him to select whatever those options will work best for him.
Thank you. And finally, there's some hysteria about the prospect of the president ordering these strikes, or someone like you in uniform providing him advice, that it's going to lead to another forever war or another endless war. Are you aware of operations, maybe operations against Iran, like the tanker wars in 1988, in which the forceful but discriminate application of military power did not lead to a forever war or an endless war, but rather led to peace and stability?
Yes, sir. Those examples in our history do exist.
Maybe the Qasem Soleimani strike in 2020 as well, that caused Iran to pull in its horns for the rest of President Trump's first term. Thank you, General K.
Well, the senator from Arkansas is conveniently forgetting Operation Martyr Soleimani, which injured dozens of U.S. troops in response to the killing of Soleimani in Iraq. But yeah, of course, this is nothing new. Tom Cotton definitely wants to be Secretary of Defense, and he's pushing a certain narrative. But this is all focused around the Iran deal. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that. As we saw Tulsi Gabbard, the Director of National Intelligence, during the Global Threats Committee last week, say definitively it wasn't any concrete evidence that Iran was trying to develop a bomb. But now we still have this rhetoric going on.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack, starting with Tom Cotton and the fact that this is someone who wrote an op-ed about sending our military against our own protesters in the U.S. So he loves sending the U.S. military out in every situation. He also talks about the Iraq War and how we shouldn't be ashamed, or he has no regrets about the Iraq War, which is by definition a forever war, right? We still have troops on the ground in Iraq. Something that was mission accomplished a month in. It was something like the iconic aircraft carrier photo. Right. And of course, we all know, the history of that, the horrors that were unleashed, the instability that it created throughout the region. The exact opposite of, by the way, what Israel's current prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, stated to Congress in 2002, I believe it was, that if you take out Saddam, it would just be stability throughout the region. That tells you something about the people, these figures that we're talking about, right? The people, these staples who have already shown us their true colors, who have already lied to us many, many times over and gotten us into the exact forever wars that that Tom Cotton puts in quotes. I mean, he's using false equivalencies, right? The assassination of Soleimani, A, was not carried out on Iranian soil, and B, was an assassination of an individual figure rather than an attack on, Iran's facilities or sovereign state or anything like that. So it's a completely different scenario. And also 2025 is not the same as 2020. So we have to keep all of these things in mind when he sort of tries to use that kind of rhetoric to almost condescend at people who are saying, hey, we've gotten into multiple forever wars. We don't seem to ever, decrease our military budgets. If we're ending forever wars, then why does our military budget keep inflating? So something is wrong in this sort of military industrial complex. And he's trying to pretend like that's not the case. Now, talking about the Iran nuclear deal and the Iran nuclear program. This is U.S. intelligence, right? U.S. assessments that Iran has not attempted any kind of weaponization of their nuclear program since 2003. Right, the U.S. intelligence says that Iran abandoned the idea of weaponization of the program. Iran denies ever having pursued a weapons program, but according to U.S. intelligence, up until 2003, they were pursuing the idea of weaponization, and that was abandoned in 2003. And the nature of Iran's current nuclear program is civil, right? It's a civil nuclear weapons program, which is legal, by the way, under international law. That's something to keep in mind. Because one of the problems with, say, the Bush administration in the early 2000s, when they were dealing with the Iran nuclear program, was their argument was that it should be zero enrichment. And that was a non-starter for Iran, because even as a member of the NPT, of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, Iran is allowed under international law to have a civil nuclear program because it has other applications such as energy and other scientific research that's not about having weapons. This is the most current assessment of U.S. intelligence still, that Iran is, and it's a choice not to have a weapons program, and now really has the technology and the ability to do so. In terms of how long it would take Iran to actually have a nuclear weapon, that's also something that the way that it's talked about in the public makes it seem like if they have enough nuclear material, that means tomorrow they're going to have, a nuclear arsenal, and that's not how it works either. According to nuclear experts, it would take Iran anywhere between 1 to 2 years to have an actual weapon, let alone multiple weapons. So that's to give you an understanding. I mean, the United States, I think last I checked, has something like 4,500 nuclear weapons. We're talking about Iran being, a year away from having maybe a couple. That's if they choose to do so. So the reason that they haven't chosen to do so, the supreme leader will argue it's immoral within Islam, which is why there's a fatwa that he's given that Iran will never pursue nuclear weapons because of religious reasons. While I'm not discounting the importance of that entirely, I'm also saying that Iran behaves pragmatically like any other state. And if they believe that their survival is in question, then that logic will quickly shift in all likelihood. And you already see now that there are the domestic debate around nuclear weapons in Iran has completely shifted in the last 10 years. 10 years ago, it was the nuclear deal, the JCPOA that was brokered between the US and Iran, and obviously the European parties as well, and the international community, was widely popular in Iran, both amongst the population. And I mean, among the political establishment, there was always the different camps, right? The hardline camp that never wanted to negotiate with the US, and those that prevailed, the reformist, more moderate camp that wanted detente with the US, that wanted diplomacy, that wanted more, economic integration into the international fold for Iran. But domestically, the debate was not about whether or not they should really have a nuclear weapon. Now, that has shifted because of the events that have come to pass, because of the US withdrawing from the deal, reimposing even stronger sanctions that they had before, the assassination of Soleimani, what we've seen, the entire sort of breakdown of even a facade of an international system. I hate to say, the international rules-based order as if it was operating in any realistic way before the Gaza genocide. It's just that the Gaza genocide sort of shattered any illusion, right? Even if it was working at 5%, it's now working at 0%. Like, that's the difference really that we're talking about. In the wake of all of that, the question internally is becoming, well, would it just make more sense to have a weapon? Would that be the greatest deterrent? Because right now that there's so much talk of both Israel and the United States carrying out attacks against Iran. So there's just a lot, I'm obviously going off on a number of tangents because there's so much to unpack about this idea of the nuclear deal. The nuclear deal at the time was meant to be what they say, like a floor to diplomacy rather than a ceiling, right? It was meant to start sort of where you could then negotiate other issues that the states have with one another. But they wanted to start with the biggest issue, which was Iran's ability to acquire a nuclear weapon, which the deal cut every path to Iran being able to acquire enough or have enough nuclear material for a weapon. The reason why Iran has expanded its program so much to this date, and as we're having this conversation, is precisely because the United States withdrew from the deal in 2018. Or else, if Iran had stayed under the limitations of that deal, we would not be in the position that we're in right now.
Right. And just for some context for the audience, Trump essentially, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, he pulled out of the deal and implemented the maximum pressure campaign in order to use the economic force and hard power of the United States in order to pressure for a deal that was essentially a better deal that was fundamentally unacceptable to the Iranian government.
Well, it also wasn't, I mean, that's not what happened.
No.
Let's say that, if you wanted to measure the success of maximum pressure,
Mhm.
it didn't stop Iran from expanding its nuclear program. It didn't stop Iran's behavior in the region. It didn't stop Iran's ballistic missile program. It didn't stop anything. If anything, what we would regard as outside, right, against U.S. interest behavior, anything that we didn't like, essentially, they did more. So it didn't. The only measure of success would be that it crushed Iran's economy and has pushed the Iranian middle class into poverty. That's the biggest accomplishment, I would say, of maximum pressure from there. But something to keep in mind when you're looking at that history is also, if we remember, the first Secretary of State under Trump was Rex Tillerson, not Mike Pompeo.
Mhm.
And when Rex Tillerson was the Secretary of State, the U.S. certified the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, meaning the U.S. acknowledged that Iran was complying with the deal and the U.S. stayed within the deal. It was within days, I think, of Secretary of State Pompeo taking over for Rex Tillerson that the U.S. withdrew from the deal and then imposed maximum pressure. So a lot of the decision making that was made at the time, and you can see that happening even now, is because of the people who are around Donald Trump, right? Who are the people advising President Trump? I would like to take him at his word that he actually doesn't want a war. It's hard to see that given the policies that he's implementing, right? You can't say you don't want a war, but then, as you've pointed out, you have this massive shift of assets to the region. Military assets are going to the region because, well, what are you preparing for? He says he's targeting the Houthis, but then he'll share something on social media that says anything the Houthis do will be seen as an action by Iran, which is, of course, nonsensical. The Houthis are an independent group. Iran in no way actually controls the Houthis.
No.
If you want to talk about the axis of resistance and this network that Iran has, there's varying relations between each one, and probably the one that Iran has the least amount of control, so to speak, over would be the Houthis. So the idea that, it would be like saying every bullet or every bomb that Israel launches is really the U.S. doing it.
Yeah. I will say, though, as a point of fairness, I think people are so sick of watching that they're pretty much going to accept that that's what's happening. But yeah, and as far as I can tell, the U.S. strategy right now for the Houthis is to try and hit whatever targets they can determine. And a part of the role of the fleet, the new fleets coming in, is going to be trying to choke off the supply line of electronics and avionics systems going from Iran to Yemen, because they don't really have a industrial base for that there. But aside from that, there's really not a lot of command and control coming from Tehran to Sana'a. So yeah,
no, and you're not. Nobody's addressing the cause. The Houthis weren't just firing into the Red Sea constantly before a genocide that was taking place in Gaza. There's a whole. This goes to the whole discussion of U.S. foreign policy, especially when it comes to the Middle East. There's no context. It's just we exist in the timeline always starts whenever we decide the timeline starts, right? The timeline starts on October 7th. For some reason, nothing apparently was happening before October 7th. So there's an entire omission of the context and the history to understand why are these groups behaving in the way that they are. Whether or not you agree or disagree with them is completely aside from the point that I'm making. The point that I'm making is without understanding why they're doing what they're doing, we have no way of resolving the issues that we want to resolve, right? If anything, this policy of we're going to fire on the Houthis or we're going to strike Yemen is exactly what the Biden admin did.
And the Saudis.
The Saudis did it for a decade,
Yeah.
But in terms of this specific sort of acute issue that has arisen from the Gaza genocide, The Biden admin did the same thing. I mean, there's a clip of a journalist asking Biden, are the strikes working? And he says, no. Are we going to keep doing it? Yes. He's like, are they working in that it's changing their behavior? No. Are we going to keep doing it? Yes. Like, that's almost verbatim what he said. And basically, there's total continuity with the Trump admin doing the exact same thing, like just doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting different results.
Right. And well, because they can't really do anything else. They can't, or they're unwilling, fundamentally unwilling to meet the Houthis' demand, which is to ceasefire in Gaza, which they followed, like they said they would when a ceasefire was implemented. Then they started, just as a timeline, shooting ballistic missiles into Israel proper when the ceasefire was violated in terms of blocking all aid in there. The U.S. is politically unwilling to force ceasefire negotiations, and they also can't get rid of the Houthis without a massive ground invasion, which we're not in the posture of doing. Even if we were insane enough to try to fight it out in the Gulf of Aden and in the mountains of Yemen, that would take like a year and a half to mobilize. So this is like not an issue that they can resolve, but they're at this point where they can't back down. I would like to circle back to this disappearance of the Iranian middle class due to U.S. economic sanctions, because just so y'all know, that's one of the main points of U.S. economic sanctions on our regional adversaries. Syria, Venezuela, Cuba. It's to create a class divide and an economic dire situation where we're able to influence the local population enough to do a popular uprising and overthrow a government that we don't like, and so we can replace it with another one. That didn't work. And in fact, U.S. economic sanctions have been backfiring spectacularly. If you know about like Russian, Iranian, British relationship or Persian relationships during like the Great Game, there's not a lot of like love lost between all the different countries there, especially with Persia and Russia. And so when I see headlines like this, I'm like, U.S. foreign policy from a diplomatic perspective is really backfiring. Russia's Iran partnership treaty ratification ahead of U.S. military buildup against Tehran. I mean, they don't have a clause in here for military cooperation, but instead of isolating Iran, like trade exchanges between the two countries have increased by 15% over the past 2 months. They have an increasing security relationship due to the war in Ukraine, and for Russia gets drones, Iran gets air defense systems, and we're seeing not just between Russia and Iran, but also another geostrategic rival, China, all coming closer together because of this. Do you have a sense that like Iran is like more stable now or less stable? Like, what do you make of this burgeoning, I guess, almost unprecedented diplomatic relationship that's taking place right now?
So, I mean, you referred to the Great Game. You're talking about, European colonialism in the 19th century and how it affected a country like Iran that was never formally colonized, but was obviously exploited by these imperial powers, lost land, gave away basically its resources through concessions. And so there's still to this day, Iranians know their history, and there's still to this day a sentiment of like anti-Russian and anti-British thinking. In fact, Americans, the US was sort of this idealized hero in the Iranian psyche until 1953, until the coup of 1953. That's when the narrative on the US shifts quite a bit. Obviously, the coup that takes out its prime minister, Iran's prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, and thwarts its democratization movement to reinstall a dictator king. This kind of shift towards countries like China and Russia, that is a pragmatic alliance. What's interesting is if you really think about, if you think about the rhetoric that you hear in the West, you hear a lot about how they're, these are fanatics and they're ideologically zealous. And like, that's the narrative of our adversaries. That's who we're dealing with. We're the very rational, Enlightenment thinkers, apparently. But in reality, it's actually US policy that doesn't align with its own interests. You see a state like Iran and a state like Russia make these adjustments when they need to because they see the pragmatic value in it. And they'll adjust back if they see a pragmatic value in the survival of their own state, if that is the case. But for whatever reason, it's the US that is approaching its foreign policy almost exclusively through an ideological lens, right? It is fanatic. Our foreign policy is not a foreign policy that is interested in US national interest. It is one that is interested in many ways Israeli national interest, a lot more than US national interest. And that is a zealous, fanatic position to be in. Just the phrase unconditional support to Israel is absurd on its face. It is absurd to say that anything should be unconditional. Everything has conditions, because you're actually looking at, well, how does this help us? Just look at how the Trump administration has handled like foreign aid, right? They came in, or DOGE, or all of these things where they're trying to say government overspending is the problem. Like every penny we spend will only be for, does it help Americans? Is it in the national interest of the United States? And guess what the exemption is to that? Always Israel. And it doesn't make any sense. We never talk about, for instance, Israel's destabilizing behavior in the region. That sentence is almost never uttered, even though that's precisely what is happening. Like the massive amount of instability you see in the region right now, the fear of our own allies and partners in the region, right? The Persian Gulf states, the Arab states in the region that are all trying to stop an escalation and war from happening. But who is the party that is adamant about an endless war? It's Israel. Hamas just offered a ceasefire proposal that is extremely similar to the one offered by the United States that would release all of the hostages. Israel rejected it because they do not want a permanent ceasefire, because they want an endless war. This narrative, by the way, within Israeli media is very, very common. The fact that Netanyahu is using the war and the hostages, exploiting the situation because he wants for his own political survival. The fact that he wants an endless war. That narrative is completely absent in Western media. It doesn't exist in the West, which is insane because that's what's happening. That's the kind of destabilizing behavior we're talking about, completely absent from the discourse in the West entirely. So it's really interesting when you look at the way these issues are talked about, because the state that's not acting in its own interest is the US, and the state that's acting like a fanatic is the US. It is pure pragmatism that has drawn states like Russia, China, and Iran together, because they're overriding their sort of ideological histories in order to do so.
Right, because we've made everyone so terrified of what happens. Sanctions, and everybody on the planet, I think every government with a lick of sense learned a lot from what happened to Gaddafi as well. That was kind of, I think, an inflection point for how a lot of nations started interacting with each other now. And after the war in Ukraine and the current belligerence here in West Asia, that's kind of what we're looking at. And when you say it's ideological, I mean, strictly like my area of expertise is basically just like in military stuff. And I'd like to remind the audience that while Iran had a relationship with groups like Hezbollah since the 80s, this idea of the axis of resistance was actually born literally out of US interventionism in West Asia. When we got into Iraq, invaded Iraq, of course, the Iranian government's not going to shed a lot of tears for Saddam. But what they did sense was, we're next. So what are we going to do? We're going to create explosively formed penetrators to cut through U.S. mechanized columns. We're going to start training and offer intelligence support to local militias. And the idea was to bog down America so much in Iraq that they couldn't come for Iran. But even at the height of the global war on terror belligerence, Iran is a completely different animal. Iraq's flat, smaller population, doesn't have mountains, doesn't have coastal areas, way easier to control. It requires a lot less people on the ground to control. I was reading reports back in 2011 when an Iran invasion was technically still on the table because we were still in the region. It would have taken pretty much all of the America's active duty force to just pull security for nation building operations in Iran. So from that perspective, and that was still probably optimistic. There's no way that we could achieve like any sort of military victory, not like we have a good track record in the region on Iran. All we could do is bomb it. And at that point, why? Like, would it appease the neocons? Or we're not going to be able to dismantle their nuclear program with bombs, a few bombs.
So there's a couple things, because when you were talking about where this like sort of the axis of resistance was born from, and that was U.S. intervention, there's also where was a group like Hezbollah or Hamas born from, and that's Israeli occupation.
Yeah.
Right? Like they came into existence, and this is what I mean when I say the context is always missing for some reason. I mean, not for some reason, because it doesn't serve the interests of like how propagandized we are in the West and in the United States about trying to understand these conflicts, because you want to make it, you know, good guy versus bad guy, and of course the Muslims and the brown people are always the bad people. Like that's the easiest way of trying to reduce, you know, this sort of classic, why do they hate us? Well, because we keep bombing their countries and exploiting their resources and killing their people and mocking them in the process of doing it, and condescending at them and telling them they don't even like their children. It's an insane situation to think of. But when you look at, I mean, you're comparing Iran and Iraq. Yeah, they're not comparable. I mean, Iraq in 2003 and Iran today are not, they're nowhere close to being comparable. And Iran is in a weakened state right now for two combinations of reasons, I would say. Both the hits that the Axis has taken, right? So it's these alliances that it has in the region have obviously been weakened. If you look at Hamas, if you look at Hezbollah, especially in Lebanon, the fall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, all of these things will clearly affect the Iran's ability to keep the war outside of its own borders, which is what it's tried to do. Domestically, it's also weakened because there is a massive legitimacy crisis. You have people who are extremely dissatisfied with the state, who you've seen increased protests, you know, sort of these periodic protests that have to be subdued with more and more violence, because not only on top of their economic woes, they're also being repressed more socially and politically. Of course, that was, if you talked to people who were proponents of diplomacy with Iran and who were against the US pulling out of the nuclear deal and imposing sanctions and maximum pressure, this was precisely the argument that was made at the time. It said you wouldn't get a sort of reformed state. What you would see is increased repression, increased violations of human rights, a more authoritarian state, because you're completely extinguishing the more moderate and reformist voices in the country. You'd also be decimating the middle class, which is precisely what's happened. And when you don't have a strong middle class, it is harder for those, even if your goal is, well, Iranians themselves will organize because they'll be so dissatisfied that they'll topple their own government. The problem with that being is when you don't have a strong middle class, it's harder to politically organize. When you saw massive demonstrations in Iran in the year 2009, when there was the Green Movement, that's because they had a strong middle class. People could go on strikes because they had a savings, they had money, they had the ability to do so. Now, no one can do things like that. So it's a really dire situation in the country as well. And I think that's why you also see a lot of mixed signals. I mean, we talk about the Trump administration. There's a lot of sort of erratic and mixed signals coming out of the Iranian government as well, in terms of their signaling whether or not they want to negotiate an actual agreement with the United States under Donald Trump.
Yeah. And what we're seeing now, though, is like they don't want to do it publicly. So what are they going to do? Like try to back channel it through Oman, which has happened before. There's talk about that. Trump said he might be open to a back channel negotiation, because as far as I'm tracking, there is no formal diplomatic relations between the two countries.
No.
Yeah.
So what the Trump administration was, I mean, he sent a letter to the Iranian Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, which is sort of wild in and of itself. It tells you something about Donald Trump, right? He is not a predictable character. He's not someone that you can easily say, well, he'll do this or he'll do that. Because what's interesting about him is he is personally not ideologically bound, right? The way that US foreign policy operates is highly, highly ideological. The way that Donald Trump operates is not. And that's why just one very simple example of that is just look at the tariffs on Israel, right? Israel's shocked. They're like, wait, but we said we're taking all of our tariffs off.
Then they got slapped at 17%.
Because he doesn't care, like it's just not the way that he operates is outside of every kind of, at least the political norms that we are used to. Whether or not those norms are good or bad, again, is not the point. It's just that whatever we're used to, he doesn't do it. And it's so interesting to see these sort of this discussion of now that Trump has come, the world order is being destroyed. It's like, well, the world order that allowed a genocide to happen for everyone to see is not a real world order to begin with. But on top of that, it's like, no, all he's doing is he's just doing it to Europeans now. What has been done to the global
Everyone
South,
else, yeah.
to everyone else this entire time, every argument that's been made, every time people try to invoke from the global South, try to invoke international law and were completely dismissed as if they were crazy. Great, now it's just happening to Europeans. Now it's happening to white people. That's what he did. And that's the hysteria. The hysteria is, how can you do this to us? Not how can you do this, because every US administration has exploited, selectively used international law, violated international law. I mean, every president is a war criminal. That's just the truth. Like every living US president is a war criminal. So it's just so interesting to see the way that he operates. Now, he wanted direct negotiations. And Iran, what we've seen so far, at least, is it seems like Iran is open to indirect negotiations. I mean, part of any agreement between these two sides, we also have to take into account the Iranian side, right? I mean, I'm telling you my opinion. If they were smart, they would have direct negotiations, because direct negotiations in any situation would likely be more successful than indirect negotiations. That's just like basic. If I'm negotiating with you, it's going to go a lot easier if I can speak directly to you.
Yeah, like you don't have to be like, what's the Omani government trying to get out of this? Like, are they double dealing? Are they trying to play both sides? Like, what's their intentions? Why do you think that they're not going to engage in direct negotiations?
So that
Or at
becomes
least not yet.
That's the domestic politics of the country, right? So right now, the hardliners have consolidated almost entirely power across the political spectrum. There's this idea that because of the death of the hardliner president Ebrahim Raisi, you now have Pezeshkian, who's supposed to be like a reformer. But he's very, very weak. His position is very weak, and hasn't really sort of stepped up to the challenge. If anything, he sort of conceded space to the hardline camp in the country. And so the hardliners are the hawks, right? They're the hawkish voices within Iran. And so they're the ones who don't want diplomacy with Iran necessarily. You've seen mixed signals from the supreme leader himself, the sort of idea that Iran will not negotiate. One of the main reasons why they won't negotiate directly is because they say they won't negotiate directly under pressure, not under maximum pressure, not under threat of, bombing and war. So they don't want to be in a position of weakness, essentially. That's what they don't want to show, is like, we have no choice but to negotiate with you directly. There's also the fact that there's sort of the history of the Trump administration and the assassination of Soleimani that plays a big role in, or a role, I should say. Maybe that role has reduced over time, but it's still something that sort of tarnished the idea of being able to negotiate with someone like President Trump directly. But again, all of that is sort of serving that's about the domestic politics in Iran more so than anything else, because from a pragmatic point of view, direct negotiations make the most sense.
Right. But again, political pressure internally makes that difficult. Also, I'm not sure if a lot of people in the U.S. government would want direct negotiations either.
No, they wouldn't. But
Yeah.
but that's what I'm saying makes Trump so interesting,
Mhm.
right? So he is the one that would do it, though, because he doesn't care.
Right.
But you're absolutely right. In the same sort of domestic political, they're almost a mirror of each other, right? There's a domestic political.
It's very interesting. Yeah.
It is very interesting. Where if Trump tried to negotiate directly, there would be a lot of backlash domestically in the United States. It would be really interesting, though, to see how Republicans who have tended to be, I mean, this is a bipartisan thing. Like being pro-Israel, which the flip side of that coin is hating Iran, is a bipartisan position. Republicans have tended to be more hawkish on Iran, if slightly, but because of how much they fall in line with President Trump, it would be very interesting to see how that would play out on the U.S. side. But of course, as of now, it's a non-starter on the Iranian side. So we'll have to see how these sort of indirect negotiations go. I mean, in terms of the assets that are being moved to the region, the argument is that it's really supposed to be focused on the Houthis, but it's also to deter Iran.
Yeah, exactly. And I've heard reports that Iran has said that they're I think this is coming from the Tehran Times, that they're pulling out military assets from Yemen because they don't want the risk of a U.S. killing Iranian military personnel and then having that be an international incident, because that would only escalate things as well. And, I mean, before the Trump administration came in, we watched the Biden administration do multiple de-escalation games with Iran. A U.S. air defense system in Syria failed to intercept a drone. About 4 U.S. soldiers were killed, or at least injured, and there was a big, smoke and mirrors show of de-escalation about like, hey, we're going to hit all these sites in Iraq, and then give the IRGC plenty of time to pull out. That we hit those sites, and basically we've just kind of seen 2 states not wanting to get into a wider, uncontrollable, chaotic regional confrontation that no one can control or anticipate. Under the Trump administration, with this buildup, it doesn't seem like Iran is in a political position to back down, and it doesn't seem like the Trump administration is going to do that and seem weak. So I guess we're kind of like circling back to, it's kind of hard to predict, but I don't know. I have a lot of colleagues that tell me, who are also who are analysts, being like, I don't think they have any other choice but to attack Iran at this point. Again, pointless, just like the Houthis. I was just getting, I don't know what your take would be on that.
I mean, I agree, but about the predictability, I think it is very difficult to predict. I will push back on the idea that there's no other choice. There's always another choice. I mean, the choice is if we're being like frank, the choice is stupid. Like attacking,
it's horrible. Yeah,
it's not. There's, I mean, as you describe it, it's so funny because it's just like they have to show that they're strong, and they have to show that they're strong. I mean, look, the United States, they're not comparable. It's ridiculous. The United States is the most powerful country in the world still, by far. We can talk about a multipolar system, which is true. It's emerging. You can see how the U.S. is sort of an empire in decline, and all these other parties are thinking, well, how do we get around the dollar? How do we get around sanctions? How, especially now that you see how the U.S. can even go against its own traditional allies. This creates even more of an imperative for all these other states to figure out basically a new world order, to say this doesn't, we can't all be beholden to this one country. And that's really the U.S. overplaying its hand, right? Overplaying its own power.
But in the meantime, the Roman legions still have 11 carrier strike groups.
We're by far the most powerful country in the world. And so that's the thing about that conversation. It's yes, you can see some far off future where this is going to happen eventually, right? The decline happens and something else, you have a new sort of system, but that is not likely to happen. We're not talking about the next couple of years. The U.S. is still by far the most powerful country in the world, and Iran is not anywhere within that realm, right? It's just not. I've always found this sort of discussion so absurd. Iran is under U.S. economic sanctions that it cannot reciprocate. It can't do anything about it. Now, that does not mean, I am not saying that Iran cannot exact a cost on the United States and the region as a whole. It can certainly do so. And so it's not to say that it poses no threat or no danger. It does. But the idea that we don't have a choice but to attack Iran is absurd, because Iran can't really do anything to us unless we attack them. That's the logic, right? We're in this school of thought of you have to attack them because they're a threat, but really they become a threat once you attack them.
And that leads into my final question. Do you think that this posturing could have the unintentional side effect of pushing people like the government to finally develop, and you kind of already answered this, a nuclear arms program? Because what I'm seeing a lot of people argue is if they didn't have a reason, now they have a reason.
So I will start this by saying I'm a non-proliferation person myself. Right. Yes. I don't think Iran should have nuclear weapons, because I don't think anybody should have nuclear weapons. I think they're bad weapons. I don't see the purpose. And it's so funny because Trump said this. I thought it was wild when he said this. He said something like, why would we need so many weapons that could destroy the earth multiple times over? I was like, that's true. I mean, I have to agree with him when he says something that is true. What is the purpose of having weapons that can annihilate everyone on Earth. So I don't think that anybody should have nuclear weapons. I think we should prevent more states from having nuclear weapons. But since we said Israel is a part of this there's always something very interesting about talking about Iran's nuclear weapons, the idea of Iran having nuclear weapons or Iran's nuclear program. There's so much fear of this notion that if Iran has nuclear weapons, Iran and other states in the region have floated the idea or have basically are okay with the idea of making the Middle East a nuclear-free zone.
Mm-hmm.
There's two countries that don't agree with this: Israel and the United States. So if you think this is a national security threat, if you think this is a global security threat, if you think that we should have less countries with nuclear weapons, then it seems like the most obvious thing to do is to make the region nuclear free. But of course, we won't even admit that Israel has nuclear weapons. Again, when I talk about the fact that we never talk about Israel's destabilizing behavior in the region, you hear about Iran's all the time, right? That phrase, that catchphrase gets used all the time. Just like Israel has the right to defend itself gets used all the time. You never hear about any other state that has the right to defend itself. Or do you ever hear Palestine has a right to exist? Nope. So it's like these propagandized phrases, these talking points get repeated over and over again until people just assume that they make sense. But what makes sense is no one has nuclear weapons. So why should Israel have a nuclear weapons program? And this is something that recently we're hearing more and more talk about, well, why isn't someone addressing this nuclear weapons program? Because they're a genocidal state.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is a fact. This is not a debate. This is a global consensus has emerged, report after report, whether it's the United Nations, multiple reports from the United Nations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, experts. Israel is committing genocide. It's not being accused of it. It's not alleged. Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. So you have a genocidal state that's occupying multiple sovereign states, that bombs them at will, that is threatening to bomb another sovereign state, that has nuclear weapons. And this is being presented in the US as the real nuclear threat is Iran. When Iran is the one that agreed to a deal that curtailed its program back in 2016, it was the United States that pulled out of it. And really, we have pushed Iran to a pragmatic point where there's a logical belief that, well, if we had a nuclear weapon, that would actually make more sense at this point, because that's the only deterrent. Everything else we've tried, right? That's the way that the logic is playing out on the Iranian side. Again, I personally disagree with it. I think there is a space for negotiations. I think they should be directly negotiating with the Trump administration. There's certainly no reason to believe that we have no other choice, but the United States has no other choice but to attack Iran. Of course, we have another choice. That choice doesn't make any sense. Does it necessarily, to circle back to Tom Cotton, if some kind of attack is carried out on Iran, does that necessarily mean that now we're in an endless war? No, there's no, again, it's unpredictable. Iran might still calculate depending on the nature of the attack, right? This very much depends on the nature of the attack that we're talking about. Might still calculate that another sort of tit for tat attack would be the better way to go. Mm-hmm. But the problem is the miscalculation. The problem is the unpredictability. So the safer bet is negotiate. The safer bet is talk this out, not let's attack and see what happens.
Well, that's kind of my concern, because I still have people that I was in the military with who are now like working in Washington, and there seems to be this real sense that a lot of policymakers, especially in the current administration, don't think Iran will hit back if we bomb their hard sites or their oil refineries or anything like that. So I think that in itself is an inherent miscalculation.
Absolutely, because when has Iran? They might be very, very careful and calculated in the way that they respond. But what we've seen is that Iran has responded. If anything, especially in the last year or so, the two retaliations that Iran carried out on Israeli soil those were unprecedented. Mm-hmm. So there's clearly the idea that Iran won't respond. I don't think that that's in line with what we've seen. I think saying that Iran would respond in a calculated and measured way, that's what we've seen. That's the precedent that we've seen. They responded to the Soleimani assassination, but they did it in a calculated and measured way. They responded to the attacks on their embassy consulate by Israel in Syria, but in a measured and calculated way. They responded to the assassination of Hania on Iranian soil, again, in a measured and calculated way. So I don't see any, there's no precedent that says that they wouldn't respond at all. It's likely, though, that they would respond in a calculated way. But that depends on what's the nature of the attack that we're talking about.
Right. I mean, it just seems like U.S. foreign policy has really been detached from reality for a long time. You have military generals not learning anything in the command echelon from the past 20 years, and politicians, at least, maybe they know it's just another adventure in West and Central Asia, but they'll get rich in the meantime. I don't know. This is kind of
say this. I just want to add this because because this is how they're looking at it. They're like, well, look at how successful Israel has been. This is the way this turn of phrase is. I don't even know how to react to it.
Yeah.
How can you look at what has happened in Gaza? How can you see tens of thousands of children killed and still use success as the word choice for what Israel has done? It's disgusting, right? Genocide, calling a genocide a success is one of the most insane things I've ever heard. But it's like,
it's also doubly stupid because they haven't dismantled Hamas by any means. So,
well, so you see what happens is you've seen these protests that have gotten a lot of media attention, anti-Hamas protests in Gaza. At the same time, you also see that Hamas is recruiting, basically like just recruiting as time is moving on as well, because that's the double-edged sword. Like, you can't just slaughtering people is not going to make your problem go away. In the same way, if you look at if we're going back to the nuclear situation with Iran, you can attack Iran's nuclear sites, but you can't dismantle their knowledge, right? They just rebuild it. What you would end up doing is kicking the can down the road. It's a decision that Iran is making not to not have nuclear weapons. It's a political decision. So what you have to address is that political decision. You can't undo the knowledge that they have, even if you attack the nuclear sites. They'll just go deeper into the ground. They'll just build in more secret. So it's like our calculation towards everything is not to solve a problem, but to put a Band-Aid on it and then wait till it bleeds out and wait till the next problem that we put a Band-Aid on.
Yeah, just really kicking the can down the road. But when we talk about a miscalculation, I'd like to end on this point. Something I warned about back in November 2023 when Israel started their massive propaganda push to drop Al-Shifa Hospital. It was like, hey guys, warfare is kind of like law in terms you need to be kind of careful of what precedent you set. And now the state bombing of hospitals and the taking out of entire tenement buildings is now normalized for modern warfare forever. So when I was doing targeting operations in Afghanistan under the Obama administration, the U.S. forces dropped a hospital in Kunduz province. It was in 2015. It was a Doctors Without Borders, massive international institute. And I was talking to people in Sana that we also dropped an oncology ward that was in the process of being built. It was a hospital. People died, and even in the Signalgate, Pete Hegseth and Mike Walz's Signalgate chat, where they were dropping classified information, we know that we dropped an entire, probably 2,000, 1,000 pound JDAM on a building, collapsed the entire thing. And I don't know, I've talked to guys that were in Baghdad and Afghanistan. Yes, a lot of civilians died, but this is new targeting parameters that I haven't seen U.S. forces use. Not apologizing for U.S. interventionism at all, but the belligerence and the actual nature of these strikes that the United States is now willing to do has completely been changed by the genocide that we've allowed to be permitted in Israel. And my concern is that belligerence has changed the face of modern warfare going forward, and makes even a miscalculation with regards to Iran even more likely.
Absolutely. And it's the Democrats that paved the way for all of it. It's the Biden administration who did it. And I think that's one of the most frustrating kind of reactions that you see from people if you are a critic of the Biden admin. And then you have people who are like, well, are you happy now? It's like, well, why do you think we're here? The argument that was being made the whole time is, if you are an administration that is saying that international law matters, and you're applying it supposedly when it comes to Russia, when it comes to Ukraine, then you cannot destroy it in the process when it comes here, because it's going to have blowback. Like this is the whole nature of blowback. This is what it is. And so everything that is happening now is happening because of what the Biden Democratic administration allowed. Once they allowed exactly what you're talking about, once basically there were no more rules. It was just, well, it doesn't, you can bomb a hospital and kill everyone in sight.
Why
as
not
long
14?
as there's a target.
Yeah.
Like, well, that argument can be made. That argument can be made by anybody, right? Anybody can make the exact same argument, but so the sort of mask of what is a terrorist is completely gone. You're just saying, no, you're a terrorist as long as it's Muslims doing it. If it's a Muslim doing it, that's terrorism. But if it's non-Muslims doing it, that's okay. We can blow up hospitals, we can blow up schools, we can blow up entire, not a residential building, a residential block, and kill everyone in it, as long as you allege that there was some kind of target there. You don't even have to prove that anything was there. You just have to say there was a Hamas target there. So now there's an entire block that's gone. So I agree, and I think that it is really frightening to live in this moment where, like you said, it's not like I said international law. It's not like it was operating in some
lofty utopian ideal of what law should be.
Well, there was something.
Yeah.
There was something. Like when you talk about the hospital in Afghanistan, I remember that as being like a wildly, like it got a lot of attention. It was a huge deal. Now Israel just bombs hospitals every day. They blow them up, and there's not even a news story about it. No one even cares, because that's how normalized it's become. And it's not just the government. It's not just the Biden admin and the Democrats and now the Republicans and Trump that did it. It's also the media. The role of the media in normalizing all of it by never calling any of it by name, by never questioning what is happening. That is how this entire apparatus has normalized this.
Yeah. And that's what we're walking in through with the next, hopefully it doesn't happen, confrontation with Iran. Thank you so much for coming on, y'all, and thanks for watching. We're kind of at the end of our time. You can follow Dr. Assal Rad on Twitter. I refuse to call it X. She does a lot of great posts correcting Western corporate media headlines to actually tell the truth about what's going on in Palestine, and also emphasizes how Israeli media is able to report what's actually going on with inside Israel. So her socials are linked in the description, as well as her book, State of Resistance, which y'all should check out. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
All right, y'all. We will see you next week. And hope you have a good weekend and don't get sucked into the insanity of it all. All right. Cheers, y'all. We'll see you next one.
Bye.